Well, I was asked to speak about my father's experiences, Steve Allen. He was teaching trigonometry to a dozen boys and girls in Marjorie Merriweather Post's former beachfront mansion in West Palm Beach when the letter arrived from his draft board. It was early 1941. On the other side of the Atlantic, only Britain stood. And President Roosevelt was building our Army and Navy as fast as he could get away with in a country not yet at war. And so as soon as the spring semester was over at this prep school, my father reported for induction. And of course, the Army has its ways of doing things, and so someone who was already in uniform decided that if you had been to Deerfield and Amherst and Harvard, you should probably go to officer school. So he did, and he was very good at going to school, so that went well. And then someone else decided that if you had an advanced degree in math, you were probably needed by the artillery, so more school. And he was still doing that, relaxing on a Sunday morning, when word came that waves of Japanese naval aircraft had arrived over our Army and Navy bases in Hawaii. And soon, of course, everyone knew that thousands of sailors and soldiers were dead and the fleet partially crippled. I asked my father what this moment was like, and he said, well, we were pretty sure this wasn't the end of it. In West Virginia, there was a National Guard artillery unit, field artillery unit, lots of guys with more than a passing knowledge of making custom alcohol, which got scaled up, and soon that unit was united with several dozen fresh Yankee graduates of officer school. One of them was my father. More training, most of 1942, half of 1943. And by September of 43, they were in San Francisco, just as hundreds and hundreds of thousands of others would go. Everyone headed for those battlefields, making their way to the ships which crossed the Pacific. And he had time before they cast off to call my mother, who jumped in his car, drove to San Francisco. They got married, had actually 2 weeks together before his unit loaded up and steamed out under the Golden Gate Bridge with 7,000 miles of water ahead. And of course, in wartime, in one begun by one Navy attacking another, one might be concerned about what might happen in the next 7,000 miles. And indeed, one day on their passage, the Army guys were mostly on deck, sort of hanging out, not much to do, and the Navy guys were running the ship. And a deck lookout said, torpedo wake. So everyone went running to that side, and indeed there was a torpedo coming straight for their ship. Closer, closer, disappeared. When it got too close, reappeared on the far side, kept going. The Japanese Navy, like ours, had a good deal of difficulty with magnetic fuses during the war. In this case, their submarine had been in the right place, done all the right things, found its target. Unfortunately, my father's ship, the torpedo ran true, but it didn't detonate, and so I sometimes ponder the fact that, were it not for malfunctions, for the difficulty of transporting and storing delicate machinery in a way that let them remain reliable, his story, their story, mine would have ended there. As you probably know, in the war, the Navy and Admiral Nimitz wanted to go west to the Central Pacific, end up more or less around Formosa, from which they could attack Japan. And the Army and General MacArthur wanted to go south to north, from Australia up to the Philippines, end up more or less at Formosa, from which they could attack Japan. And neither of them really enjoyed cooperating with the other that much, which was, I think, especially understandable in the case of the Navy. My father didn't necessarily speak that highly of General MacArthur. But my father was in the Army, so he was part of that south to north effort. And he said, not all of Army life was unpleasant. But there were surprises. One day, while they were stationed on a very pretty beach, one of these West Virginia soldiers sat down cross-legged, put a lovely big coconut in his lap, opened it up with a bayonet, and at the same motion severed his femoral artery. So one moment that fellow was more or less in paradise, and the next moment he was gone, which reflects being around lots and lots of stuff that's designed to wreak havoc. After staging for some time in Australia, they fought in New Guinea for a while, which was part of the initial attempt to break Japan's outermost defenses, and that was finally successful, and so they went on to participate in the invasion of southeastern Philippines, either Luzon or Mindanao, I forget which. And that led to a dicey moment. Shortly after the landings, the Japanese Navy very cleverly managed to lure away the American fleet that was supposed to protect the landings. Some decoys were involved. And then a fairly powerful Japanese task force showed up, behind which was their largest battleship, actually the world's largest battleship. And all of this was designed to destroy the landings and everything that depended on the landings. It was a very dicey moment, but in an action that he wasn't involved in, but as stirring as any in the war, a small force of American destroyer captains went charging up this fairly narrow strait at night, very dark night, and launched torpedoes at this fairly powerful Japanese force. Nearly all of the American ships were sunk with massive loss of life, but the Japanese force was startled by the ferocity of this attack, unsure what they were facing in this narrow passage in a dark night, and so turned around. In fact, behind the American force, which mostly sacrificed itself, was a force of battleships which had been frantically salvaged and upgraded from the floor of Pearl Harbor in the months after December 41. They were prepared to conduct one of the world's last battleship duels, and that would have happened but for what happened with the destroyer captains and the Japanese response. But again, I sometimes ponder that were it not for the incredible boldness and sacrifice of those Navy fellows, my parents' story could have ended there, but then not so long a time. So the Philippines campaign went on. My father's field artillery unit was doing what it did, which is to provide fire support basically for division headquarters, whatever division headquarters wanted to get done, they were supposed to do. And in the nature of things, they're supposed to be somewhat back from things, kind of the opposite of where Elgin would be. The artillery is supposed to be a mile or two back so that they can hit lots of different places. But one day something very unusual happened. The infantry unit in the line in front of them was removed for rest and recuperation, and somehow no one arrived to replace them. And so that evening, suddenly, middle of the night actually, Japanese infantry arrived at the location of my father's field artillery unit. Well, this is not something that's supposed to happen, and history buffs will remember that the climax of the Battle of Gettysburg, many people think the climax of the Civil War, was the third day of that battle, in which the Confederate Army, led by Virginians under Pickett, crossed this long, long field at the Union artillery. The Confederate Army and the South really never recovered militarily from the losses that day. And by 80 years later, in 1944, field artillery was much, much more lethal than it had been in 1864. So this engagement went on for some time. My father's unit, I'm told, set their howitzers. They had very large guns. to zero elevation, which means, straight out, and the ammunition to zero fuse, which means the ammunition is supposed to go off very quickly after leaving the tube. And for quite some time this went on. Something very scary for everyone on both sides, but ultimately much sadder for all the patriotic, I'm sure, fellows on the Japanese side. When it was over, I think the casualties in the field artillery unit were very small, but the Japanese unit basically didn't exist any longer. When the war ended, my father was writing a letter to my mother, as he did several times a week, and this is the only one of his that I've read. I'm not sure what it is. It might be an accident, or it might be my mother's favorite that she had been recently rereading when I looked at these. But he says, after at least 2 years away at this point, he says, "As I write this, under the mess tent, word has come over the loudspeakers that the Japanese government has ended the war. There's quite a downpour, yet I can hear the guys shooting off every possible thing they can get their hands on." It reminds me of Lieutenant Sampan. It's hard to believe it's over. And in the center of this page, these neat and perfect pages of this very careful man, as we all know, had created, there was a single water stain and a run of ink. I don't know if it was his tear or a drip from the mess tent roof, but it seemed, reading it, like an acknowledgement of all that had happened in the prior years. The hundreds of thousands of lives ended or disrupted or changed forever. 3 months later, my mother drove his car from Holyoke to Camp Devens on Route 2, the same car she had driven to San Francisco before he shipped out. A telegram had arrived that he was due. He didn't arrive, she waited. Word came of delays en route. She got a room, waited the next day. He didn't arrive. Finally, in the wee hours of the morning, in a misty rain and in darkness, a bus did arrive, the doors opened, he stepped off, and it was over.